All right, good morning or afternoon, guys. So today we are going to be talking about the 3D Pythagorean theorem. So up until now you've been using the Pythagorean theorem to solve sides on a right triangle, right? Well, today we're going to be working with rectangular prisms. And we're going to be using that Pythagorean theorem to solve for parts of the rectangular prism. So specifically this diagonal line right here. So before I write down the steps and everything like that, I kind of want to prove what the 3D Pythagorean theorem is. So I just want you guys to pay attention real quick. Just a refresher, the Pythagorean theorem is a squared plus b squared equals c squared. Okay? So when I look at this 3D shape right here, right? If I wanted to use the Pythagorean theorem to solve for this diagonal side, I would need the legs of that triangle, right? So the legs of that triangle would be this bottom diagonal right here that's going along the base of the rectangular prism, and it would be this side. Those three sides together would form a right triangle, right? It would be a diagonal right triangle, but it would be a right triangle that would kind of go diagonally through that shape. So I do know this side length already, right? It's going to, since it's a rectangular prism, it should be 2, right? Because it's the same height all around. Now, what I need to know would be one of these other sides, right? So I can't solve this without knowing this side, but I could solve this bottom one, right? Because I could use the Pythagorean theorem. So I could do 7 squared plus 3 squared equals that side squared, right? So 7 squared plus 3 squared, I'm going to take out my calculator here. 7 squared plus 3 squared is 58. And that's going to equal that longest side squared. We'll just call it c squared. And then I would square root to get it by itself, which would be about 7.61. Okay? But it's also, I could also think of it as the square root of 58, which I could also think of as the square root of 7 squared plus 3 squared. Okay? Now, that's probably a lot to think about, but let's just leave it as this form right here. So the square root of 7 squared plus 3 squared. Now, I have the two lengths of the triangle here, right? I can then combine them and use them to use the Pythagorean theorem again. This would be one leg, this would be another. So I could write it as the square root of 7 squared plus 3 squared plus 2 squared would equal this longest side squared. We'll call it d squared for diagonal, right? Now, when I square a square root, they cancel each other out, right? So I'm going to be left with 7 squared plus 3 squared plus 2 squared equals that diagonal squared. Okay? Then, I could then plug all that in. So 7 squared plus 3 squared plus 2 squared equals 62. Square root of 62 is going to be about 7.9 if I round it, would be the length of the diagonal. But let's look at what I have written right here. So right here we have these two side lengths, right? And then we have this side length. So we have the length, the width, and the height. If we square those and add them together, it should equal the diagonal squared. And that is our 3D Pythagorean theorem. If I call this A, B, C, it'd be like a squared plus b squared plus c squared equals the diagonal squared. So our 3D Pythagorean theorem is a squared plus b squared plus c squared equals d squared. So what I want you guys to do now is get out your notes or a scratch piece of paper or turn to page 37, whatever you want to do, and we're going to write this down right here. This is the 3D Pythagorean theorem. And this is just A would be your length, B would be your width, C would be your height, and that's going to equal the diagonal. Diagonal squared. Okay? So it's really not that tough. It's basically just the Pythagorean theorem again, just with an extra number that we're squaring. So let's look at another example now that we've got that. So the first step is to identify, let's actually look at this one right here. So the first step is to identify your length, your width, and your height. Okay? So first step, where's my, okay. There we go. Number one, identify length, width, and height. So here, my length is 60. My width is 50. And my height is 20. The next step is to plug in to the 3D Pythagorean theorem. Okay, so I would have 60 squared plus 50 squared plus 20 squared would equal the diagonal squared. Next step would be to square and combine like terms. Okay, so I'm going to square. 60 squared is 3,600. 50 squared is 2,500. And then 20 squared is 400. Combine those, and you are going to get 6,500 would equal the diagonal squared. Okay? And then the last step is to square root. So to undo the square, you need to square root both sides. So the square root of 6,500 is 80.62 blah blah blah. We're going to round it to 80.6. Would be the length of that diagonal right there. 80.6 centimeters technically. And that's what you're doing for the 3D Pythagorean theorem.